Sky over France, July 12, 1944. The fuel gauge needle trembled at the red mark, and Captain Lee Archer understood perfectly that he had no more than 8 minutes of flight left, maybe less. Outside his fighter, the temperature had dropped to minus 28 degrees Celsius and below through torn clouds. 32 heavy bombers crawled slowly toward their targets, filled with crews and deadly cargo. On the side of his aircraft was an inscription, the name of a girl from Georgia he had left at home, waiting for his return. The tail of his plane blazed bright red, that same color that would make his squadron legendary and which now simply helped distinguish friend from foe in the chaos of aerial combat. Lee was only 25 years old, a black man from Harlem who by all laws and regulations should not have been there, because the United States Army officially maintained that black people were biologically incapable of operating complex combat aircraft. This was his 97th combat mission. He had 7 German aircraft to his credit, had saved dozens of bombers from certain death. But still, when he returned home from this war, he would be denied a bank loan to buy a house, simply because he was black. The radio suddenly crackled to life. The voice was calm and professional, but the words made Lee's heart beat faster. German fighters, 6 aircraft, heading straight for the bombers. Lee turned his fighter toward the enemy, knowing that the next 8 minutes would decide not only the fate of this particular battle, but would become another page in history, proving a simple but revolutionary truth. Skin color does not determine courage, does not determine skill, does not determine the right to fly and fight. But to truly understand the significance of this moment, when a black pilot from racist America prepared to engage the best pilots of Nazi Germany, we need to return to the beginning of this incredible story, to the place where the impossible slowly, painfully, but inevitably became possible. In the summer of 1941, in the heart of Alabama, where racism was not just a social attitude but official law enshrined in state constitutions, 13 young African Americans stepped off a bus at Tuskegee Army Airfield, arriving with a dream that seemed absurd to most white Americans. They wanted to become military pilots. The United States Army did not want them there. Moreover, it created this program not for them to succeed, but to obtain scientific, documented proof of their inevitable failure, which would close the question of black pilots once and for all. There existed an official document, a report from the U.S. Army War College, dated 1925, and remaining active doctrine until 1940, which stated in black and white that the black people possessed inferior intelligence and insufficient mental fortitude to operate complex combat machines. This was not the opinion of one individual racist or a group of biased officers. This was official military doctrine of the United States of America, backed by pseudo-scientific research, skull measurements, and intelligence tests that were specifically designed so that African Americans would fail them. In 1940, there was not a single black pilot in U.S. military aviation, absolute zero. When World War II began, and millions of young Americans rushed to recruitment offices to volunteer, black men were told the same standard line. Sorry, the Air Force does not accept colored people into pilot training programs. But political pressure from civil rights organizations was growing. They demanded equality, demanded the opportunity to serve their country on equal terms with whites. The Army found its cynical compromise. They would create an experimental program, try to train black people to operate combat aircraft, and, when they predictably failed, the question would be closed forever with scientific confirmation. The location for this experiment was not chosen by accident. Tuskegee, Alabama, the very heart of the segregated American South, where black people could not drink water from the same fountains as whites, could not enter buildings through the same doors, could not sit in the same sections of restaurants and movie theaters. The first thing these 13 young men, full of hopes and dreams, saw upon stepping onto the military base that was supposed to make them pilots: signs reading "Whites Only" on the doors of the officers' mess, at the entrances to bathrooms, above drinking fountains. They had come to serve their country, to risk their lives for its defense, and from the first minute their country informed them that they were not equal to white citizens. that their place was separate, that they were considered inferior. But these young men had a commander, a man who understood their situation better than anyone else in the American Army, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Davis, the first African-American graduate of the prestigious West Point Military Academy in the 20th century. For 4 years at that academy, from 1932 to 1936, he was subjected to systematic ostracism. Literally, not a single white cadet spoke to him outside of strictly necessary training sessions. He lived in a solitary room, ate alone, marched separately from everyone during drill. 4 years of absolute social ostracism, specifically designed to break him psychologically, to force him to quit, to prove that a black man could not withstand the pressure of military academy. But this ordeal did not break Benjamin Davis. It turned him to steel, hardened his character to a strength that would allow him to lead hundreds of young black men through the hell of training. At the first formation of new cadets on July 13, 1941, he told them the truth without any embellishment or consolation. The generals in Washington are actively praying for you to fail. Half the instructors on this base are openly betting that in a month none of you will be here. You are not wanted here. The program was created not for your success, but to obtain scientific proof of your biological inferiority. He slowly walked along the formation, stopping before each cadet, looking each directly in the eyes, and continued with words that would enter the program's history. You have only 2 choices. First, give up now, return home, and confirm their correctness. Give them the proof they so desperately want to obtain. Or second, prove with every action, every flight, every successfully completed task that they were damn wrong. And you will prove this not for them, not to satisfy white generals, but for every black child in America who will look at the sky and say to himself, if they could do it, so can I. Lee Archer was born in Harlem, one of the few neighborhoods in New York where African Americans could live relatively freely, on September 6, 1919, just 1 year after the end of World War I, to a family that belonged to America's tiny black middle class. His father worked at the post office, which was one of the few stable government jobs available to black men in those years, and his mother taught at a school for colored children. Together they provided the family with an existence that was not wealthy, but not poor either. Lee was an exceptionally intelligent child from an early age. Mathematics came to him so easily that teachers predicted a brilliant future for him. He indeed graduated from school with excellent grades, which allowed him to enter New York University, where he studied mathematics. But more than anything, stronger than any formulas and equations, he was drawn to the sky. That endless blue emptiness above the city that promised freedom that did not exist on the ground. He spent hours standing on the roof of his house in Harlem, watching planes take off and land at the newly opened LaGuardia Airport, following them with his eyes until they became tiny dots on the horizon, thinking about one thing. There, in the sky, there is no whites-only sign. There is no skin color. There is only you, the machine, and endless space where you are truly free. When on December 7, 1941, Japanese aviation bombed the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, killing more than 2,000 Americans and dragging the United States into World War II, Lee was 22 years old. Like millions of other young Americans, he felt a patriotic impulse. He immediately went to the nearest recruitment office to volunteer, because he wanted to defend his country, and most importantly, he wanted to finally get the opportunity to fly. The white sergeant at the desk in the recruitment office did not even look up at him, continuing to fill out some papers, and pronounced the standard phrase that thousands of black men heard across America. The Air Force does not accept colored people into pilot training programs. Next, please. But Lee did not give up, because he had read in one of the African American newspapers about the new program at Tuskegee, that the Army was beginning experimental training of the first black military pilots. He immediately applied, passed through a series of grueling tests, demonstrated his mathematical abilities and physical fitness, and was accepted. In the summer of 1942, when he turned 23, he arrived in Alabama with a suitcase full of hopes and firm belief that he would fly, that his dream of the sky would finally come true. But he did not yet know what an incredibly cruel path he would have to walk, what he would have to break through to earn the right to be called a pilot. Training at Tuskegee was designed with one single goal: to break people physically, psychologically, and emotionally, weeding out everyone who showed the slightest weakness, the slightest doubt in their abilities. Wake-up occurred at 4:30 in the morning, to the sound of a siren that tore cadets from sleep, followed by a 10-kilometer run in full military gear. Then push-ups that had to be done until arms literally gave out. Then pull-ups to complete physical exhaustion, and more running. This was only the morning warm-up, physical training designed to identify the weak and break the unprepared. Then, the real test began. Classes. Cadets studied aerodynamics with its complex formulas of lift and air resistance, meteorology, with analysis of weather conditions and their effect on flights, navigation with course calculations and wind considerations, the design of aircraft engines with their thousands of moving parts, and all this continued for 14 hours a day, at desks, without weekends, without respite. White instructors, many of whom openly did not believe in the abilities of black cadets, explained the most complex material at such a frantic pace that it was physically impossible to write everything down, let alone understand it the first time. If you did not understand something from the first explanation, those were your problems, because asking for repetition meant showing weakness, and any weakness, any manifestation of insufficient preparation, was tantamount to a death sentence for your dream of flying. By the end of the first week of training, out of 40 cadets in Lee's group, only 32 remained. 8 had already left, either voluntarily surrendering, admitting they could not meet the incredibly high requirements, or expelled by instructors for insufficient physical fitness or inability to absorb the theoretical material. Then, real flights began, those very moments for which all these young men endured abuse and humiliation, physical exhaustion, and psychological pressure. The first time Lee took to the air was in August 1942 in a 2-seat open cockpit biplane, where the instructor sat in the rear cockpit and he in front. The wind hit his face, the engine roared, the ground slowly went down, and suddenly, the whole world transformed. The moment the wheels left the ground and the plane soared into the sky, everything else simply ceased to exist. Racism, constant humiliation, anger, resentment, fatigue, all of it remained below, on the ground. Here, at an altitude of 1,000 meters, there was only him, the machine, and endless sky around. The instructor handed him control, and the plane immediately jerked to the right because Lee pulled the control stick too sharply. He tried to level the machine and it jerked left. His hands trembled with tension and adrenaline, sweat poured into his eyes despite the cold oncoming air. The instructor's voice sounded in the headphones. "Relax, Archer. The plane wants to fly. It's designed for flight. Your task is not to fight with it, but to gently guide its movements, as if you're dancing with a partner, not fighting an enemy." And Lee suddenly understood, felt it at some intuitive level. It was like learning to hear music you hadn't noticed before, like discovering a new sense in yourself. A light movement of the stick to the right, and the plane obediently banks. Pressure on the pedal, and the nose of the machine turns in the right direction. In November 1942, he made his first solo flight, took to the air for the first time without an instructor, completely alone, completely responsible for every decision, every movement. He took off, made a perfect circle over the field, returned and landed the machine so softly that the instructor then came up to him and said words Lee would remember forever. "You were born to fly, Archer. You have a natural talent that is rarely found." But the joy of these moments was short-lived and constantly overshadowed by the reality of attrition, which continued mercilessly, week after week, month after month. Documents that would be declassified 30 years after the war's end would show the whole truth about this program. Instructors were given direct instructions to evaluate African American cadets significantly more strictly than whites, to use any possible reason for expulsion, and the subjective assessment of one single instructor, often based on racial prejudice rather than actual abilities, could instantly end a career, with no right of appeal or retake. Of the 40 people who began training with Lee in the summer of 1942, only 14 made it to the very end, to receiving pilot wings, a 65% attrition rate. While white cadets going through similar training programs had this indicator at only 35 to 40%. Despite the fact that the average intelligence quotient of African American cadets was statistically higher than that of whites. Those who survived this merciless selection system were not just good pilots or even excellent pilots. They were absolutely exceptional professionals because they had to be 1.5 to 2 times better than their white colleagues just to be considered worthy of wearing pilot wings. In February 1943, Lee Archer received silver pilot wings and the rank of second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Air Forces. His father came to the awards ceremony, taking a rare day off from work. When Lee walked onto the parade ground in officer uniform, with silver wings pinned to his chest, he saw tears on his father's face. In the spring of 1943, Lee was sent to serve in the 99th Fighter Squadron, the very first all-African American combat pilot squadron in United States history, commanded by that same Lieutenant Colonel Davis, who had met them at the first formation at Tuskegee 2 years earlier. In April, they sailed to North Africa aboard a transport ship, 27 pilots and 400 ground personnel. Mechanics, armorer, radio specialists, all African Americans, all heading to war to defend a country that officially did not consider them full citizens. They were first based in Morocco for acclimatization and additional training, then transferred to Tunisia, closer to the active combat zone. They were issued old fighters, a model that white squadrons had long since written off as obsolete and replaced with more modern machines. These planes were slower than German fighters, worse armed, less maneuverable. But this was all they were given, and they had to fight with what they had. On June 2nd, 1943, the 99th Squadron made its first combat sortie, a simple patrol of airspace over the island of Pantelleria, which the Allies were preparing to capture as an intermediate base for further operations. They did not encounter any German aircraft that day, but this had no bearing on the historical significance of the moment. Black pilots had, for the first time in the history of American military aviation, performed a combat mission. The real battle, the real baptism by fire, came a month later, on July 9th, 1943, when Allied forces began the large-scale Operation Husky, the landing in Sicily, the largest amphibious operation up to that point in the war. The 99th Squadron received the critically important task of covering landing ships from attacks by German bombers. Lee flew as part of a group of 8 fighters over the landing beaches near the town of Gela. Around 3 in the afternoon, a ground radar station detected an approaching group of German aircraft. Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers heading for ships packed with soldiers and equipment, covered by fast and deadly Messerschmitt fighters. Lieutenant Colonel Davis gave the order to intercept in a voice so calm and professional, as if he were ordering coffee at a cafe rather than leading his men into their first real air battle where they could die. Lee chose one of the German bombers, methodically as he was taught at Tuskegee, closed the distance, controlling every movement of the control stick. 400 meters, 300, 250. At this distance, he pressed the triggers. 6 machine guns opened fire simultaneously with a deafening roar, and the plane shook from recoil. Tracer bullets drew fiery lines through the blue sky. But they all passed by the target, because Lee made the classic mistake of a beginning pilot. He did not account for lead, did not aim at the place where the enemy aircraft would be in fractions of a second, but shot where it was now. Second approach, and this time Lee corrected his aim, firing ahead of the German bomber's trajectory. When he pressed the triggers again, the result was completely different. Hits. Pieces of metal skin flew from the wing and fuselage of the German machine. Thick black smoke poured from the engine. The bomber sharply banked and began to fall, leaving a smoke trail, and crashed into the Mediterranean Sea with a huge explosion and fountain of water. This was the first confirmed enemy aircraft shot down on Second Lieutenant Lee Archer's combat record, a moment that under any other circumstances would have caused euphoria and triumph. But there was no time to celebrate. A German fighter got on his tail with professional precision. Lee saw the characteristic flashes of machine gun fire and jerked the control stick left purely by instinct, not thinking, relying on reflexes. His fighter sharply banked at a steep angle, and the German burst past exactly where his plane had been a second ago. Lee threw his machine into a steep dive, almost vertical, using one of the few advantages of his obsolete fighter: the ability to withstand extreme overloads. The German followed him into the dive, but at a certain altitude, apparently afraid of his machine's structural limitations or simply not having enough experience for such maneuvers, fell behind, turned around, and headed back to his lines. Lee returned to base with a racing heart and adrenaline still boiling in his blood. His plane had not received a single hole, not a single hit. But when he climbed out of the cockpit, his hands shook so badly that he could barely unfasten his safety belts. The squadron mechanic, an African-American sergeant named Wilson, approached him with a slight grin on his face and spoke words that became the traditional greeting for pilots after their first battle. "Welcome to the real war, Lieutenant." While Lee and his comrades fought in the skies over the Mediterranean Sea, risking their lives and proving their competence with bullets and blood, a completely different war unfolded on the pages of American newspapers and in the offices of military command. A war of opinions, reputations, and political interests. In September 1943, Colonel William Momyer, commander of the 33rd Fighter Group to which the 99th Squadron was attached for tactical operations, sent a confidential report to the headquarters of the 12th Air Force, claiming that African-American pilots were showing unsatisfactory results in combat operations, demonstrating insufficient aggressiveness in air battles, and did not meet the standards expected of fighter squadrons. This report, of course, immediately leaked to the press, because there were people in Washington who actively wanted to see the Tuskegee program fail. Major American newspapers published articles with headlines like "Experiment Failed," "Black Pilots Cannot Handle Combat Tasks," and military sources confirm colored aviators insufficiently competent for modern warfare. The problem with this report was that it was based either on flagrant ignorance of facts, or on conscious manipulation of statistics, or on pure racism. Most likely on a combination of all three factors. By the time this document was written, the 99th Squadron had flown more than 500 combat sorties, lost only 2 aircraft in air battles against much more experienced German pilots flying significantly superior machines, and had shot down 6 confirmed enemy aircraft. Moreover, when military historians after the war conducted detailed analysis comparing the statistics of the 99th Squadron with other American fighter squadrons during the same period in the same operational zone, it turned out that African Americans showed above-average results across all key parameters: ratio of shot down to lost, percentage of successfully completed missions, accuracy in attacking ground targets. But these facts did not matter to Colonel Momyer and those who shared his views, because they looked at black pilots through the lens of racial prejudice, where any result that was not absolutely outstanding and exceptional was immediately interpreted as proof of inferiority. Lieutenant Colonel Davis, upon learning of this report, immediately demanded a meeting with General Carl Spaatz, commander of strategic air forces in Europe. This meeting took place in October 1943 at headquarters in Algiers. Davis brought with him a folder stuffed with documents, precise records of every combat sortie, detailed reports of every air battle, statistics of losses and victories, testimony from white pilots from other squadrons who fought alongside the 99th, and gave it exclusively positive assessments. He laid out these documents before the general and said directly, without diplomatic evasions, "Sir, Colonel Momyer's accusations are either based on incomplete information or motivated by racial prejudice. The facts speak for themselves. My men fight no worse and often better than white squadrons. If you close the program now, based on this biased report, you will commit a historical injustice." General Spaatz, to his credit, was a professional military man who valued results over prejudice. He carefully studied the presented documents, conducted his own independent investigation, questioned many officers, and ultimately not only completely rejected Momyer's recommendations, but expanded the program, ordering the formation of 3 additional African-American fighter squadrons. These three new squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd, united with the 99th into a single 332nd Fighter Group under the command of Benjamin Davis, who by this time had been promoted to colonel. It was this group that would enter history under the legendary name Red Tails. In January 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group was transferred to Italy, initially based near the city of Montecorvino, then moved to Ramitelli Airfield on the east coast, from where they could effectively cover strategic bombers during their deep raids into Germany, Austria, and occupied Europe. Here in Italy, they received new aircraft, P-51 Mustang fighters, absolutely the best fighter machine of World War II, with a range of more than 2,000 kilometers, maximum speed of 700 kilometers per hour, and armament of 6 12.7mm machine guns. These machines were so good, so superior to everything they had flown before, that when Lee first took to the air in a Mustang, he felt as if he had been riding a bicycle before and now sat behind the wheel of a race car. The first thing the pilots did with their new fighters was paint the tails bright red, that same color that would become their distinctive mark and give them their legendary nickname. This was a practical decision. In the chaos of air battle, when the sky is filled with dozens of aircraft spinning in a deadly dance, when you have fractions of a second to determine friend from foe, a bright red tail allowed instant identification of comrades. But it was also a symbolic statement, a proud announcement to the world. We are here, we fly, we fight, and our red tails will be the last thing German pilots see before they fall from the sky. The task set before the 332nd Group was simultaneously critically important and incredibly dangerous. To escort heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator during their daylight raids on strategic targets deep inside Germany. These huge four-engine machines carried crews of 10 people each, and bomb loads of up to 3 tons. They flew in tight combat formations of several hundred aircraft at a time, and their main vulnerability was German fighters that attacked the bombers in waves, trying to shoot down as many as possible before they reached the target. The standard tactic for escort fighters used by most white squadrons was to fly with the bombers to a certain point. Then, when German fighters appeared, rush after them trying to shoot down as many enemy machines as possible, because this gave personal victories, increased the pilot's score, brought medals, and glory. The problem with this tactic was that while escort fighters chased German aircraft many kilometers from the main group, other German fighters attacked defenseless bombers. Losses among heavy bomber crews were monstrous. In some missions, they shot down up to 10 to 15% of machines, meaning hundreds killed in one sortie. Colonel Davis made a radically different tactical decision. His pilots would not chase German fighters to rack up personal victories. They would stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back. Their only task was not to shoot down as many enemies as possible, but to protect the heavy bombers entrusted to them at any cost. This meant that the Red Tails would have fewer personal victories, fewer medals, less glory. But it also meant that bomber crews would return home alive. Very soon, rumors of this reliability spread through all bomber groups stationed in Italy. Strategic bomber crews began specifically requesting Red Tails escort. They felt significantly safer seeing those characteristic bright red tails beside them. A legend appeared that cannot be fully documented but was repeated by thousands of bomber aviation veterans. Not a single bomber under Red Tails escort was ever shot down by enemy fighters. This legend is not entirely accurate. Documents show that several bombers were still lost, but their number was so small compared to other escort groups that statistically it looked like an anomaly, like an incredible achievement, especially considering that the Red Tails flew some of the most dangerous and deep missions into the very heart of Germany. On March 24, 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group received orders to escort a formation of 72 heavy B-17 bombers in a raid on the Daimler-Benz tank factory in Berlin, one of Nazi Germany's most important strategic facilities, producing engines for Panther and Tiger tanks. This was a maximum-range mission, requiring a flight of more than 1,000 kilometers each way, practically at the limit of even the long-range Mustang's capabilities. Intelligence warned that the Germans had concentrated huge numbers of fighters to defend the capital. Opposition of at least 100 enemy aircraft was expected. By this time, Lee Archer was already a captain, an experienced pilot with dozens of combat sorties and several confirmed victories. He led a flight of 4 fighters covering the right flank of the bomber formation. When they crossed the German border at an altitude of 7,000 meters, the temperature outside dropped to -35 degrees Celsius. The first wave of German fighters appeared over Dresden, about 20 Focke-Wulf FW-190 machines, fast, heavily armed, piloted by experienced Luftwaffe pilots, many of whom had been fighting since 1939 and had dozens of downed aircraft to their credit. They went for a head-on attack on the bombers, standard tactics designed to make escort fighters give chase, leaving the bombers vulnerable. But the Red Tails did not take the bait. They remained at their positions, turning to face the attacking Germans, and opened fire at maximum range, creating a wall of tracer bullets between the attacking fighters and the bombers. The Germans were forced either to break through this fire, risking being shot down, or to turn away, losing the opportunity to attack the main targets. Lee saw one FW-190 coming straight at him, not deviating from course despite machine gun fire. This was either a very brave or very desperate pilot. They were closing at a speed of more than 1,000 kilometers per hour. At the last moment, literally a second before collision, the German jerked his machine down. Lee turned to follow but lost him in the clouds. The formation continued flying toward Berlin, leaving behind the first wave of attackers, but more waited ahead. It was like passing through a minefield where the mines were alive and hunting you. The second wave appeared over Berlin itself. More than 50 fighters, absolute concentration of German forces. They attacked from all directions simultaneously, trying to overwhelm the defenders with numbers. The sky turned into chaos, into an interweaving of aircraft trajectories, spinning, diving, tumbling in a deadly dance. Tracer bullets drew fiery lines through the gray March sky, smoke from damaged engines, parachutes of downed pilots slowly descending to earth. Lee saw one of the Red Tails to his left take a hit to the engine and begin to fall. The pilot ejected, but whether he fell in territory controlled by the Allies or was captured by the Germans, Lee did not know. He attacked a Messerschmitt Bf-109 that had gotten on the tail of one of the bombers. Long burst, hits on the wing and fuselage. The German sharply turned away and went down smoking, possibly shot down, possibly just damaged. The bombers dropped their deadly cargo on the target, hundreds of tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs that turned the tank factory into a sea of fire and destruction. Then they turned back, and the long, exhausting journey home began, across all of Germany, past anti-aircraft batteries and fighter bases. Another 1,000 kilometers where a new wave of attackers could appear at any moment. Lee constantly checked the fuel gauge, watching as the needle slowly but inexorably crawled toward the red mark. They flew at maximum economy mode, but even that might not be enough. The radio came alive with the voice of the group leader. It was Colonel Davis himself. All flights, maintain formation and conserve fuel. If anyone cannot make it to base, report immediately. We'll try to find a place for emergency landing in liberated territory. They crossed the Alps at sunset. The mountain peaks were painted in pink and golden colors of the setting sun. Then, the Adriatic Sea appeared, and finally, when the fuel gauge needle had already frozen at the very red mark, the lights of Ramatelli airfield appeared ahead. Lee landed his machine with the last liters of fuel in the tanks. The engine stalled literally the moment he taxied off the runway onto the taxiway. Of the 72 bombers that departed on this mission under Red Tail's protection, 70 returned home. 2 were lost to anti-aircraft fire over the target, but not one was shot down by fighters. Of the 64 escort fighters, 3 were lost. All pilots ejected and later returned through the front lines. This was one of the most successful escort missions to Berlin in the entire war. When the bomber crews returned to their base, they told their commanders that the black pilots with red tails fought like men possessed, not retreating a meter from the protected machines. Rumors of this mission spread throughout the aviation of the Mediterranean theater. The war continued, mission after mission. Lee Archer flew again and again. His victory count grew. 7th downed German aircraft, 8th, 9th. By the summer of 1944, he was one of the most experienced pilots in the entire 332nd Group. A true ace whom young pilots just arrived from Tuskegee listened to with reverence when he shared air combat experience. On July 12, 1944, that very day with which this story began, he led a flight of 6 fighters escorting bombers attacking an oil refinery near Vienna, a strategic target critically important for supplying the German war machine with fuel. The mission began as usual, a routine sortie like 100 before it. But about halfway to the target, a ground radar station detected a large group of German fighters heading to intercept 6 machines against an unknown number of enemies, possibly 20, possibly 30. But it did not matter because the task was clear: protect the bombers at any cost. Lee saw them from afar, characteristic silhouettes coming to meet them. He gave the flight a command: prepare for battle, maintain formation, attack only those who break through to the bombers. Do not chase retreating ones. Distance closed at terrible speed, 1,000 meters, 800, 600. Now, they were distinguishable in detail. Lee chose a target, the leader of the German group, because if you shoot down the leader, the rest might get confused, lose coordination. Closing, aiming, accounting for lead and relative speed. Short burst, hit to the engine. The German fighter sharply banked and went down smoking black smoke. Possibly shot down, possibly not. But he was no longer a threat to the bombers. Second German, approach from the side, longer burst, hits on the wing. Pieces of metal flying in different directions. The aircraft enters uncontrolled spin. Definitely shot down. But at that moment, when Lee was following the falling German fighter to confirm the victory, he made a fatal mistake that an experienced pilot should never make. For a second, he lost situational awareness, did not check what was happening behind him. The hit was sudden and brutal. Machine gun burst, hit the tail section of his Mustang. The rudder was partially destroyed, several hits to the fuselage. One bullet passed just centimeters from his head, piercing the instrument panel. Lee instinctively jerked the control stick, throwing the machine into a steep turn, but the plane reacted sluggishly and reluctantly. The damage was serious. Control partially lost. The German fighter that attacked him, a Focke-Wulf 190 with characteristic black and white stripes on the fuselage, was turning for a repeat attack. Lee understood that in his damaged state he would not be able to perform complex evasion maneuvers. The only chance: attack himself, go for head-on closure, play a deadly game where the loser is whoever flinches first and turns away. Lee turned his damaged fighter nose straight at the attacking German. Both aircraft went toward each other on meeting courses with a combined speed of more than 1,000 kilometers per hour. Both pilots opened fire simultaneously. Time slowed in these last seconds of closure. Lee saw the flashes of machine guns on the wings of the German fighter, saw tracer bullets flying straight at him, felt the impact of hits on his plane, but kept his finger on the trigger, continuing to fire. At the last moment, literally meters before head-on collision, the German jerked his machine down. Lee saw thick smoke pour from the engine of the German fighter, saw the plane begin to fall, obviously seriously damaged by his fire. But he had no time to celebrate the victory because his own machine was on the verge of catastrophe. The engine was running unevenly. Smoke trailed from several holes in the wings and fuselage. Controls responded with difficulty, and the fuel gauge showed that some bullet had punctured the fuel tank, and fuel was leaking at a terrible rate. Lee tried to call the flight leader on the radio, but the radio was damaged, producing only the crackle of interference. He was alone, in a damaged aircraft, deep in enemy territory, with leaking fuel and partially failed controls. Any normal pilot in this situation would immediately head for the nearest airfield, even if it meant landing in enemy territory in captivity. But Lee Archer was not an ordinary pilot. He had been taught that the mission was more important than personal safety, that the bombers he was supposed to protect were full of people whose lives depended on him. He directed his damaged machine back to the formation, ignoring all warning signals, all the pain from shrapnel wounds he had received when bullets pierced the cockpit. The fuel gauge needle was at the red mark, and Lee knew he had no more than 8 minutes of flight left, maybe less. But these 8 minutes were critically important because at that very moment, a third wave of German fighters appeared. 6 machines heading straight for the bombers. Lee knew that his damaged fighter could not fight effectively. It was barely staying in the air. But he also knew he could distract at least some of the enemy from the bombers. And that might be enough for the other Red Tails to handle the attack. He turned his machine toward the Germans. When they saw the lone fighter, obviously damaged, smoking, coming straight at them, 2 German pilots, apparently deciding this would be easy prey, separated from the group and went for him. Lee opened fire at maximum range, not really aiming, just creating the appearance of a threat. The Germans, not knowing how seriously his aircraft was damaged, reacted with standard defensive maneuvers, losing precious seconds. Those seconds gave the other Red Tails time to get into position and attack the main group of German fighters before they reached the bombers. In the subsequent chaos of air battle, Lee struggled to keep his dying machine in the air, evading attacks from the 2 German fighters circling around him like sharks around wounded prey. His Mustang barely responded to controls. Each movement of the stick required enormous physical effort. The engine choked and died, then came alive again for a few seconds. One of the Germans moved in for the decisive attack. Lee saw the flashes of his machine guns, felt new hits on the fuselage. Suddenly he was saved by the person he least expected to see. Young pilot 2nd Lieutenant Wendell Pruitt, who had arrived from Tuskegee just 2 months ago, appeared literally out of nowhere and gave a long burst at the attacking German. The German fighter exploded in midair, turning into a fireball. Pruitt shouted over the radio, "Hang on, Captain, I've got you covered. Lead us home." But Lee knew he would not make it home. He had fuel for 2, maybe 3 minutes maximum. He made a decision. Turned the machine toward the nearest territory, controlled by the Allies, a section of Italian coastline liberated by American forces several weeks earlier. The engine finally died at an altitude of 1,000 meters. The propeller stopped, and the Mustang turned into a glider slowly losing altitude. Lee found with his eyes a relatively flat field near a small village, leveled the machine as well as he could with damaged controls, and went for an emergency landing. The impact with the ground was brutal. The landing gear crumpled from overload. The plane slid across the field about 100 meters, tearing up the earth, then sharply tilted and flipped on its side with a deafening screech of metal. Lee hit his head on the instrument panel, lost consciousness for a few seconds, came to from the smell of smoke and fuel, understanding that the machine could explode at any moment. With great effort, he climbed out of the overturned cockpit, fell to the ground, and crawled away from the aircraft, expecting an explosion. But the explosion did not follow. The fuel had already completely leaked out during the flight. American soldiers from the nearest unit, hearing the crash of the fall, ran to the crash site and helped him up. A medic examined his wounds, multiple shrapnel wounds, nothing critical, concussion from the impact during landing, bruises and abrasions. But he was alive. 3 days after treatment in a field hospital, he returned to his base at Ramitelli, where he was met as a hero. Colonel Davis personally pinned to his chest the Distinguished Flying Cross, the second most significant military award after the Medal of Honor. The citation read, "For exceptional courage and devotion to duty, expressed in continuing to perform the combat task of protecting bombers despite serious aircraft damage and personal injuries." But the most important reward for Lee were the words of the commander of one of the bomber groups they had escorted that day. He came to the Red Tails base specifically to personally thank them. He said before the formation, "Thanks to your actions, all my crews returned home alive. You saved hundreds of lives. The color of your skin has absolutely no significance. You are the best escort fighters I have ever flown with." The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with the complete capitulation of Nazi Germany. By this time, the 332nd Fighter Group had set a record that would remain unsurpassed. More than 15,000 combat sorties. 112 confirmed enemy aircraft shot down in air battles. another 150 destroyed on the ground in ground attack missions. And most importantly, they escorted more than 1,000 bombers. And the loss statistics under their protection were the lowest among all fighter groups. Of the 992 pilots who went through the Tuskegee program during the war years, 66 died in combat. 32 were captured, but the rest returned home as heroes, having proven once and for all that skin color does not determine courage, does not determine competence, does not determine the right to serve one's country. Lee Archer returned to America in the fall of 1945 with 4 combat awards, 9 confirmed downed German aircraft, which made him an official ace, more than 100 combat sorties, and absolute confidence that the world had changed, that after what they had proven in the skies over Europe, American society could no longer treat black people as second-class citizens. He was wrong. In the very first week after returning to New York, walking down the street in parade officer uniform with awards on his chest, he entered a restaurant to have lunch. The waitress told him politely but firmly, "Sorry, sir, we do not serve colored people. You will have to leave." He tried to explain, showed the awards, told that he had just returned from the war where he defended this country. But the restaurant manager simply called the police. 2 policemen asked him to leave the establishment because he was disturbing the peace. A month later, he went to a bank to arrange a loan to buy a house in a decent neighborhood. He had savings, a stable military pension, an impeccable credit history, but the bank clerk refused him without even considering the application on its merits, explaining that the bank does not issue loans to black people for purchasing real estate in white neighborhoods. He tried to get a job as a pilot in commercial aviation. He had experience, qualifications, recommendations, but not a single American airline hired black pilots. This was an unofficial but absolutely strict policy that would continue for another 20 years. The racism they had hoped to defeat with their exploits turned out to be much more tenacious and deeply rooted than it seemed from an altitude of 7,000 meters above the battlefields of Europe. Segregation in the southern states remained law until the mid-1960s. Discrimination in employment, education, and housing policy continued for decades more. But the story of the Red Tails did not pass without trace. It became a symbol, proof, a weapon in the struggle for civil rights. When in 1948 President Harry Truman issued an executive order on desegregation of the armed forces, abolishing official racial discrimination in the Army, he directly referenced the outstanding achievements of black pilots from Tuskegee as proof of the absurdity of racist military doctrines. When in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education declared school segregation unconstitutional, civil rights movement lawyers used the example of the Red Tails as an argument against the theory of the innate inferiority of African Americans. When in the 1960s Martin Luther King Jr. led marches for equal rights, among the demonstrators walked gray-haired veterans in worn flight jackets with 332nd Fighter Group patches. Their presence was a silent but powerful reminder. We proved our equality with blood and courage. Now give us our constitutional rights. Lee Archer lived a long life. He died in 2010 at the age of 90, living to see times when a black man became president of the United States, when black pilots fly in all airlines of the world, when racial segregation became a shameful relic of the past condemned by the entire civilized world. In the last years of his life, he spoke frequently at schools and universities, telling young people his story. His favorite phrase, which he repeated again and again, was, "We were created to fail." The entire system was designed to prove our inferiority. But we not only did not fail, we exceeded all expectations, because we believed in ourselves even when the whole world said we were not good enough. In 2007, all living veterans from Tuskegee were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian award of the United States. The ceremony was held in the Capitol, and President George W. Bush personally presented awards to these gray-haired old men in wheelchairs, saying in his speech, "You fought 2 enemies simultaneously, Nazism overseas and racism at home. And you defeated both, and our country is forever in debt to you." Today, at the Aviation Museum at Tuskegee Base, stands a restored P-51 Mustang fighter with a bright red tail. Every year, thousands of schoolchildren come here on excursions to hear this incredible story about how a group of young black men from racist America became one of the most effective and respected combat units of World War II. The story of the Red Tails is not simply a military history about air battles and tactical victories. It is a story about human dignity, about the right to prove your worth even when the entire system is set against you, about the fact that courage has no skin color, and that justice, though slowly, inevitably defeats prejudice. In the sky over France, on that distant July day in 1944, when Captain Lee Archer with nearly empty tanks turned his damaged fighter toward the enemy instead of saving his own life, he was not thinking about history or symbolism. He was simply doing his job, protecting comrades, completing the mission, keeping his word. But it is precisely such moments of individual courage, repeated by hundreds of other pilots thousands of times throughout the war, that created the legend that changed the country and the world, proving a simple but revolutionary truth. A person is defined not by his race or skin color, but by his actions, his character, his willingness to give everything for what he believes in. The Red Tails in the sky over Europe were not just an identification mark of the squadron. They were a banner of freedom, equality, and human dignity, raised to an altitude of 7,000 meters where everyone could see it and where it was impossible to ignore. And this story continues today. Every time a young man or woman of any race, nationality, or origin looks at the sky and says, "If they could do it, so can I." Every time someone fights injustice and prejudice, remembering those who fought before them.